Now that your husband is gone, you should grieve, pack your things and never come back, my daughter-in-law said during dinner, her voice cold and sharp. My son just smiled slightly and nodded as if agreeing without a second thought. The house was never really yours anyway. I didn't argue. I moved out the very next morning, quietly, without saying a single word to either of them. The following day I went straight to the bank, my chest still heavy with grief. It had only been a week since we buried my husband of 32 years, yet it felt like an entire lifetime had passed. The dining room already felt like a stranger's place without his presence. The long mahogany table where we'd shared countless family meals seemed too big, too empty, even with the three of us sitting there. I couldn't stop glancing at his empty chair, half expecting to see him sitting there, smiling that gentle smile of his. Every breath felt heavy, almost painful, as if my grief was pressing down on my chest. "Pass the potatoes, please," my daughter-in-law, Chelsea, said in a tone sharp enough to cut glass. She had never spoken kindly to me, but tonight something about her felt even colder. My hands trembled as I reached for the serving bowl. At 71 I had thought I was ready for this, ready to say goodbye. But nothing could have prepared me for this hollow, aching emptiness that followed me everywhere now. My son, Brian, 43 years old, sat between us, looking more like a referee who had already picked a side than the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when nightmares scared him. He barely looked at me all evening, his attention locked on his wife of 15 years. Trying to break the awful silence, I said softly, "The service was beautiful, wasn't it? Your father would have loved seeing so many people there." Chelsea carefully set her fork down, her movements slow and deliberate. "Yes, well, that's actually what we need to talk to you about, Martha." My stomach tightened instantly. I looked between her and Brian, hoping to find at least a little warmth after the loss we'd all shared. Instead, I saw cold calculation in Chelsea's eyes and my son's nervous avoidance. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though my heart already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Chelsea straightened, her back stiffening in that way she always did when she was about to issue one of her ultimatums. I'd seen it before, usually when she was explaining why Brian couldn't visit me as often or why family traditions had to be changed to suit her. "Brian and I have been talking," she began, her voice laced with that fake sweetness she used whenever she wanted something. "Now that Henry is gone, this house is going to be too much for you to handle on your own." I blinked in confusion. Too much? I had been taking care of this house for over 30 years. I knew every creaky floorboard, every stubborn faucet. "Exactly," Chelsea said, her pleasant mask slipping just a little. "You're not getting any younger, and maintaining a house this size costs money. Brian and I think it would be better if you moved somewhere more suitable." Her words felt like a punch. This was my home. Henry and I had built our life here. Brian grew up here. "Mom, Chelsea's right," Brian finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "The upkeep alone is going to be overwhelming for you." "I'm not helpless, Brian," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Your father and I saved for years to buy this house. Every single room holds our memories." Chelsea's expression hardened. "Memories don't pay utility bills or property taxes. Be practical, Martha." I stared at her, this woman who had spent 15 years slowly pulling my son away from me. She had convinced him that Sunday dinners with me were too stressful, that holiday visits should be divided between families, though somehow they always spent more time with her relatives. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though the answer already felt like ice in my stomach. "We think you should consider one of those nice senior communities," Chelsea said, pretending as if she were doing me a favor. "You'd have people your age, activities. It would be better than wandering around this big empty house all by yourself." I turned to Brian, desperate to see any sign that he didn't agree with her. "Brian, you really think I should sell the house where you grew up? The house your father and I—" "It makes sense, Mom," he cut me off, still not looking at me. "And honestly, Chelsea and I could use the space. We've been talking about expanding our family, and this house has so much potential." His words hit me like cold water. They didn't just want me to leave. They wanted my house, the home Henry and I had lovingly restored room by room for 3 decades. Chelsea's voice suddenly dropped all pretense of kindness. "Now that your husband is gone, grieve, pack your bags and never come back. This house was never really yours anyway." She said it like she was throwing out old furniture, not talking to her husband's mother. Brian looked at me then, and for a brief moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even guilt. But then he smiled and nodded. She's right, Mom. This house was Dad's, and now it's mine. You were just living here. Those words hit me harder than a slap, tilting my entire world on its axis. Just living here, as if 32 years of marriage, of building a life, of raising a family together, meant nothing more than being a long-term house guest. I see, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, even as something inside me began to crack. It wasn't just my heart breaking. It was my entire understanding of who my son really was, of who my family had become. I stood slowly, my legs weak. I'll need some time, at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks should be plenty, Chelsea interrupted sharply, not even letting me finish. That's enough time to find somewhere suitable and arrange for movers. 2 weeks. Not 2 months, not even a reasonable amount of time to grieve or to pack away an entire lifetime. Just 2 weeks to dismantle 32 years. Brian finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was worse than anger or even resentment. It was indifference. Complete cold indifference to my pain. It's for the best, Mom, he said quietly, as if he were trying to convince himself just as much as me. You'll see. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I had shared with Henry, each step feeling like I was hauling my grief uphill. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne, and his reading glasses were exactly where he had left them on the nightstand the night before his heart attack. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me didn't look 71. She looked older, beaten down, her silver hair limp and her blue eyes dull with grief and shock. In just 2 weeks I was supposed to leave this room, the room where I had whispered goodbye to Henry only 7 days ago. I was supposed to pack 32 years of marriage into boxes and hand over everything to a son who had just told me I never truly belonged here in the first place. But as the daylight faded, something else began to rise beneath all that grief. A small, hard spark of determination. Henry had always been the one who handled our finances, but he had taught me to pay attention to details, to be thorough. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would start making arrangements. I would call the bank and find out exactly what I was entitled to. If Brian and Chelsea thought they could just erase me from this family without consequence, they were in for a surprise. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows differently, brighter somehow, as I sat at the breakfast table sipping my second cup of coffee. 10 days had passed since that awful dinner, and the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. Brian and Chelsea had already been by twice, measuring rooms and discussing renovations as if I weren't even there. Yesterday I had overheard Chelsea on the phone with a contractor coolly saying, "Once the old woman moves out." I had spent those 10 days in a strange fog, mechanically sorting through my belongings, trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. But today I finally felt ready to deal with the practical matters Henry would have expected me to handle. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through familiar streets I had driven for over 20 years, always with Henry in the passenger seat. He used to handle everything at the bank himself, saying it was one less thing for me to worry about. Now I wished I had paid more attention back then. When I walked into the bank, Helen Patterson, the branch manager, greeted me with that careful sympathy reserved for widows. "Mrs. Walker, I'm so sorry about Henry. He was such a gentleman, always asking about my grandchildren." "Thank you, Helen. He spoke kindly of you too," I replied, settling into the chair across from her desk, my purse clutched tightly in my lap. "I need to understand my financial situation. Henry handled everything and I'm afraid I'm lost." Helen nodded sympathetically. "Of course, let me pull up your accounts." She began typing quickly, her eyes scanning the computer screen. Then her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh my." My heart jumped. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly," she said, her tone careful. "There are just quite a few accounts here. More than I expected. Let's start with the joint checking account you and Henry used for household expenses." She printed out a statement and slid it across the desk. The balance was modest but enough to cover several months of expenses if I was careful. Relief washed over me. At least I wouldn't be destitute. "There's also a savings account in both your names," Helen continued, handing me another printout. The balance was much larger. Enough to support me comfortably for years if needed. "That's wonderful," I murmured, feeling some tension ease from my shoulders. Henry was always careful about saving. "Yes, very methodical," Helen agreed, still frowning at her screen. "But Mrs. Walker, I'm seeing several other accounts that are in your name only." When was the last time you reviewed your full financial portfolio with Henry? My name only? I asked confused. That doesn't sound right. Henry handled everything. Helen's fingers flew over the keyboard again. According to our records, there are 4 additional accounts, 2 CDs, a money market account, and, this is interesting, a trust account established 5 years ago. My head spun. I don't understand. Henry never mentioned any of this. Helen glanced at me carefully. Did your husband ever express concerns about your family situation? Sometimes clients set up separate accounts as protection, just in case of disputes or outside pressures. The question caught me off guard. Protection? From what? But as she spoke, I thought back to Henry's quiet concerns in recent years. How he had questioned Chelsea's spending, how he had grown tense whenever Brian brought up their financial troubles, how he had insisted on handling all the banking himself and never let Brian accompany him. Can you tell me more about these accounts? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. Helen printed several more pages. The first CD has been renewing annually for 7 years. The second was opened 3 years ago. The money market account has been receiving small automatic transfers. $50 here, $100 there, from your joint checking account. Over time it's grown into quite a sum. The numbers on the statements made me dizzy. These weren't small emergency funds. This was real money, enough to buy a house, enough to live comfortably for decades. But how? I never signed anything. Actually, you did, Helen said gently, pulling a folder. Your signatures are here on all the documents. My guess is Henry brought you in to sign them, probably telling you they were just routine updates or insurance forms. She slid the papers to me and there they were, my signatures witnessed and dated. I remembered some of those visits. The time we updated our address after the house numbers changed, the day we switched to a new checking account. He never told me what I was signing, I whispered. It's not unusual, Helen said kindly. Some spouses prefer to handle the details themselves. And legally, everything is above board. These accounts are yours. I sat there in stunned silence, realizing what this meant. While Brian and Chelsea were already treating me like an unwanted guest in my own home, while they were planning renovations for their future, I had resources they didn't even know existed. There's one more thing, Helen said cautiously. The trust account. It's been receiving transfers from a business account for the past 5 years. The Walker Construction Trust. That was your husband's company, wasn't it? Yes, but Brian told me the sale barely paid off debts. Helen looked at the screen again. According to our records, the business account is still active. There have been regular deposits and transfers to your trust account. Mrs. Walker, I think you should talk to the business accountant. There may be more to your financial picture than you realize. I left the bank in a daze, my purse heavy with papers. Instead of going straight home, I pulled into a small cafe parking lot and sat in the car, reading through every page Helen had given me, my mind racing. The numbers didn't lie. Henry had been protecting me all along, quietly and systematically, without ever telling me. Every account, every investment, every trust fund, everything had been set up to ensure I would always be financially independent. As I studied the trust account statements, a pattern became clear. The deposits lined up perfectly with Brian's visits over the past 5 years. Always larger amounts right after he had asked his father for small loans, or when Chelsea had dropped hints about their financial struggles. Henry had been giving our son money, yes, but he had been setting aside an equal or even greater amount for me. It was as if he had known that one day I might have to stand on my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. Mom, Chelsea found a realtor to list the house. We can start showing it next week. Hope you're making progress on finding a place. I stared at the message for a long time, then looked back at the bank statements in my lap. They were so confident, so sure they had control of everything. But they had no idea their plans were built on a foundation they didn't understand. Tomorrow I decided I would call the business accountant. I needed to know exactly what else Henry had left behind. The grief was still there, sharp and heavy as ever, but beneath it, something else was beginning to grow. A quiet, steady strength I hadn't felt in years. The accounting office, Morrison and Associates, was tucked between a dry cleaner and a tax service in a modest strip mall. I had never been there before. Henry had always handled the business meetings himself, claiming it was boring paperwork that would only give me a headache. Now I realized he had been protecting me from far more than just tedious forms. Margaret Morrison looked to be about my age, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been handling Walker Construction's books for over 15 years, and when I called yesterday, her voice had been polite but carefully neutral. "Mrs. Walker," she said warmly as she gestured to the chair across from her cluttered desk. "First, let me say how sorry I am for your loss. Henry was a good man, and one of the most honest businessmen I ever worked with. I'll miss our quarterly meetings." "Thank you," I said softly, sitting down with my purse clutched tightly, the bank statements tucked safely inside. "I wish I'd known him as well in business as you did. I'm trying to understand our financial situation." The bank mentioned ongoing business income one wasn't aware of. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "You weren't aware? That's unusual. Henry spoke about you often. I assumed you were fully informed." She hesitated, then added gently, "Please tell me what you'd like to know." "My son tells me the business was sold years ago and barely covered its debts," I said. "Sold?" Margaret looked genuinely confused. "Mrs. Walker, Walker Construction wasn't sold, it was restructured. 5 years ago, Henry transferred the company's assets into a trust, the Walker Construction Trust. You're listed as the primary beneficiary." The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. "I own the construction company?" "Well, technically the trust owns it, but you own the trust," Margaret explained. "It's been very successful, actually. Your husband was extremely careful about the contracts he accepted after restructuring. Smaller jobs, reliable clients, steady income instead of the risky boom and bust cycle of larger projects." She printed several pages and handed them to me. "These are the profit and loss statements for the last 5 years." I stared at the numbers, my hands trembling. The annual profits were substantial. More than enough to explain the regular deposits into the trust account. "But Henry retired," I said weakly. "He wasn't working anymore." "He stepped back from day-to-day operations, yes," Margaret said. "But he still oversaw everything and made strategic decisions. The actual construction work has been managed by Tom Bradley. I believe you know him." I nodded. Tom had worked for Henry for over 20 years, starting as a young apprentice and eventually becoming foreman. He had been at the funeral, one of the few people who seemed genuinely heartbroken. "Tom has essentially been running the company for the past 5 years," Margaret continued. "Henry set it up so Tom receives a percentage of the profits as a performance bonus. It's kept him motivated and loyal. It's been a very successful arrangement." Why didn't Henry tell me any of this? The question came out in barely more than a whisper. Margaret hesitated. "Mrs. Walker, this might not be my place to say, but Henry was concerned about family pressures. He mentioned that your son had financial problems and that his wife had expensive tastes. He worried that if your family knew about the business income, there would be expectations and demands that could compromise your future security." The pieces fell into place with painful clarity. Every time Brian had asked for a loan, every time Chelsea had made little comments about how comfortable we seemed, Henry had been calculating how to help them without putting my independence at risk. "He was protecting me," I said quietly, the realization sinking in. "He was protecting both of you," Margaret said gently. "The loans he gave Brian over the years were substantial, but they all came from the business operating account, not from your personal assets. And he documented everything carefully." She opened another file and slid it toward me. "These are copies of all loan agreements between the business and your son. Henry insisted on formal contracts, payment schedules, interest rates, everything." My hands shook as I opened the folder. Page after page of loan documents stared back at me, each signed by both Henry and Brian. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, all supposedly for Brian's various business ventures and investments. "Has Brian been making payments?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Margaret's expression turned uneasy. "According to the payment schedule, there are significant arrears. As of last month, the outstanding balance with accumulated interest is approximately $87,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Brian owed nearly $90,000 to the family business, my business, while claiming his father had left nothing but debts. What happens to those loan obligations now?" I asked. "They transfer with the business assets," Margaret explained. "As the new owner of the trust, You have the legal right to demand payment or restructure the terms as you see fit. I thought of Brian and Chelsea measuring my kitchen, planning their renovations, speaking as if my home already belonged to them. They were so sure, so confident they deserved everything Henry had built. There's one more thing you should know, Margaret added carefully. Last month your son contacted me directly. He said that with his father's passing he'd be taking over management of the business affairs. He asked me to prepare transfer of ownership documents. I told him I needed written authorization from the trust beneficiary. He seemed surprised you were even involved. So Brian had been planning to claim the business just as he had claimed the house, assuming I was too grief-stricken or naive to notice. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. Margaret, I need to ask you something confidential, I said firmly. If I wanted to keep the current structure with Tom continuing to manage operations, would that be possible? Absolutely, Margaret said with a reassuring smile. Tom has been waiting to hear from you actually. He's worried about the company's future. If you're willing to keep things as they are, you'll find him loyal and very grateful. I gathered all the papers, my mind spinning with everything I had just learned. The business was mine. The debt Brian owed was real and legally enforceable. And neither he nor Chelsea had any idea their grand plans were built on lies and assumptions. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Tom as soon as possible, I said firmly. And I want to understand all of my options regarding the outstanding loans. Of course. I'll call Tom this afternoon, Margaret replied. And please, I added, lowering my voice, I'd appreciate it if this conversation stayed confidential for now. Absolutely, Margaret said. Client confidentiality is sacred in this business. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with another text from Chelsea. Martha, the realtor wants to schedule a photographer for tomorrow. Make sure the house is clean and decluttered. First impressions matter for potential buyers. I stared at the message for a long moment, then slipped my phone back into my bag without replying. Let them schedule their photographer. Let them dream about their future in my house, spending money they believed they were entitled to. They had no idea the foundation of their plans was about to crumble under them. That evening I sat in Henry's study for the first time since his death, surrounded by his neatly organized files. Now I understood why he had been so meticulous, why every transaction had been documented and filed away so carefully. He had been building a fortress around me, one record, one signature at a time. And tomorrow I would begin learning just how strong those walls really were. The next morning, Tom Bradley sat across from me at the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug. At 55, he still had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man who'd spent his life building things, but his eyes carried a weariness I hadn't seen before. Mrs. Walker, I have to be honest, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've been worried sick since Mr. Henry passed. Brian stopped by the job site last week talking about evaluating assets and streamlining operations. It didn't sound good for folks like me. I poured myself another cup of coffee, using the familiar rhythm of the task to steady my nerves. Tom, what exactly did my son say to you? He said the family was having financial troubles, that tough decisions had to be made about the business. He wanted me to give him a list of all current contracts, equipment and cash flow projections. Tom's jaw tightened. He also asked for the keys to the equipment yard and the office. And what did you tell him? I told him I'd need to speak with whoever was actually in charge now. Mr. Henry always told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was to wait for proper instruction from the legal owner. Tom's gaze met mine steadily. He never said that would be Brian. Relief flooded through me. Henry had planned for this, making sure Tom would protect the business rather than hand it over to anyone who simply claimed authority. Tom, I need to share something with you, I said carefully. But I need your word this conversation stays between us for now. His expression grew serious. You have it, ma'am. I spread out the documents Margaret had given me the day before. I own Walker Construction. Not Brian. Not the estate. Me. Henry transferred everything into a trust 5 years ago, and I'm the sole beneficiary. Tom's eyes widened as he studied the papers. Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, ma'am, but Mr. Henry was always thinking 3 steps ahead. He was, I said softly. And according to these records, the business has been very profitable under your management. A flicker of pride crossed Tom's face. We've built a solid reputation, Mrs. Walker. Steady clients, quality work, fair prices. Mr. Henry always said repeat customers were worth more than any big one-time deal. I want you to keep running things exactly as you have been, I said firmly. But I need to understand something. Brian hasn't been honest about our family's finances. Can you tell me about any conversations you've had with him regarding the business? Tom's expression darkened. There have been plenty. He'd come around when Mr. Henry wasn't there, asking about cash flow, wanting to know when clients were making payments. A couple of times he suggested the business could help him out with some temporary funding for his investment opportunities. And what did you tell him? That he needed to talk to his father. I'm not stupid, Mrs. Walker. I knew what he was doing. Tom's voice hardened. Last year he even showed up at the bank the same day we deposited a big payment from the Morrison office building project. Said it was just a coincidence, but he was mighty interested in talking to the teller about the deposit. My stomach tightened. Brian had been watching the business income, probably timing his loan requests to when the cash flow was strongest. Tom, I need you to be completely honest. Do you think Brian knows how much money has been running through this business? Tom thought for a long moment. I think he knows it's more than what your family has claimed, but I don't think he knows the full extent. Mr. Henry was careful. He kept business and personal finances separate, at least on paper. What do you mean? Your husband was smart. Whenever Brian asked for help, Mr. Henry would say the business was struggling, that margins were tight. But then he'd find a way to help anyway, always as a loan from the business account, never personal money. Tom pulled out a small, well-worn notebook. I keep track of everything, Mrs. Walker. Mr. Henry taught me that. According to my records, Brian has received about $93,000 from the business over the past 5 years. The number was even higher than Margaret had told me. Payments? Not loans. I asked. Loans on paper, yes, with payment schedules and all. But Mr. Henry never enforced them. Brian would miss payments and Mr. Henry would just let it slide. So Brian thinks he owes nothing. Brian acts like he owes nothing, Tom corrected. Whether he really believes that or just pretends, I couldn't say. As if summoned by our conversation, I heard a car door slam outside. Through the kitchen window, I saw Brian's gray Honda Pilot parked behind Tom's work truck. That's my son, I said quietly. I don't want him knowing we've been talking about the business. Tom nodded and quickly gathered the papers. Mrs. Walker, whatever you decide, you have my full support. Mr. Henry trusted you enough to put everything in your name. That's good enough for me. Brian walked in without knocking, something Henry had always disliked but I'd grown used to over the years. Morning, Mom, he said, barely glancing at Tom. Didn't know you had company. Tom stopped by to check on me, I said smoothly. You know how thoughtful he's always been. Right? Brian said, already scanning the kitchen like he was evaluating it for resale. Actually, Tom, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about the business situation. Tom's face became unreadable. Oh. With Dad gone, there are going to be changes, Brian said, his tone casual, almost dismissive. The family needs to make some practical decisions about assets and ongoing obligations. I watched the exchange closely, fascinated. Brian was so sure of himself, so confident in his authority. He had no idea he was trying to claim something that had never been his. What kind of changes? Tom asked calmly. Well, we need to evaluate whether it makes sense to keep operations going or if it would be better to liquidate assets and settle debts. I see. And who exactly is making these decisions? Brian blinked, caught off guard. The family, of course. I'll be handling Dad's business affairs from now on. Will you now? Tom asked, his voice neutral but with the slightest edge. Mom, why don't you make some fresh coffee? Brian said, waving me off like he always did when he wanted me out of a serious conversation. Tom and I need to discuss some technical details. But I didn't move. For the first time in years, I stood my ground. I'll stay, thank you. This is my kitchen and Tom is my guest. Brian looked surprised but shrugged. Fine. Tom, I'll need you to prepare a full inventory of all equipment, vehicles, and current contracts. I'll also need access to the business accounts so I can assess the financial situation. I'd be happy to help with that, Tom said carefully. Who should I coordinate with for account authorization? With me, obviously. And you have legal authority to access Walker Construction accounts because? Tom asked, his tone polite but firm. Brian hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. Because I'm Henry Walker's son and heir. I see. And do you have documentation proving you're authorized to act on behalf of the business? The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock above the sink. Brian's face tightened and I could see him wrestling between irritation and doubt. Look, Tom, I don't think you understand the situation here, Brian said finally, his voice slipping into the condescending tone he always used when he felt challenged. This isn't a hostile takeover, Brian said, his voice tight. I'm trying to clean up Dad's affairs and take care of everyone. But I can't if you're going to make things difficult. I'm not making things difficult, Tom replied evenly. I just need to know who I'm supposed to take orders from. Your father was very clear about proper procedures. Brian turned to me, clearly expecting support. Mom, explained to Tom, I'm handling Dad's business now. I looked at my son, the man planning to sell my house and who owed nearly $90,000 to the business, and made my choice. Actually, Brian, Tom is right. Your father was always careful about these things, I said. Brian stared, confused. What are you talking about? I'm talking about doing everything properly and legally, I replied. For the first time, Brian looked uncertain and I felt something I hadn't in years. Power. The call came 3 days later, early in the morning. Mom, we need to talk now, Brian snapped. Chelsea and I are coming over. The line cut off before I could answer. I dressed carefully, choosing the navy blue dress Henry had always admired. If this was a confrontation, I would face it with dignity. Exactly 20 minutes later, Chelsea's heels clicked across the porch. I opened the door before they could knock. Good morning, I said pleasantly. Chelsea brushed past me into the living room, her purse clutched like a weapon. Brian followed, grim-faced. They stood between me and the door like guards. Mom, Tom called me yesterday, Brian said angrily. He won't give me business information without authorization. What did you tell him? I sat in Henry's favorite chair. I told him to follow proper procedures. Your father would have wanted that. Proper procedures? Chelsea snapped. Brian is Henry's son and heir. Legal authorization, I said calmly. The kind that comes with ownership. Brian frowned. Dad's will leaves everything to the family. I'm the executor. Not quite, I said, opening the folder Margaret Morrison had given me. Your father's will leaves personal items and this house to the family. But Walker Construction hasn't been part of his estate for 5 years. Brian's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I placed the trust documents on the table. The company belongs to the Walker Construction Trust, and I'm the sole beneficiary. The room fell silent. Chelsea grabbed the papers, her fingers trembling. Brian's face paled. This is impossible, Chelsea whispered. You're right, I knew nothing about business, I said. But your father clearly understood our family situation better than I did. Brian collapsed onto the sofa. But the business was struggling. Actually, it's been profitable, I said, handing him financial statements. Brian's hands shook as he read. Where did the money go? Some of it to you, $87,000, I said, handing over loan documents. Chelsea snatched them. These say loans. Brian, you said they were gifts. They were gifts, Brian muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Margaret Morrison has every agreement, every missed payment, I said. This doesn't change anything, Chelsea snapped. The house is still Brian's. It's worth $400,000. It's a lovely property, I said. But there's the mortgage. Brian's head jerked up. What mortgage? 18 months ago, your father took out a $350,000 home equity loan. The money went to the trust. It's part of my inheritance. Chelsea went pale. That's not possible. We'd have known. Your father was the sole owner, I said. He didn't need your signatures. But why would he do that? Brian asked. Because he was protecting me, I said, finally letting emotion show. From this, being thrown out of my own home by family who saw me as a burden. Chelsea's composure cracked. You manipulated him. Your father wasn't dying when he planned this, I said sharply. He did it because he knew what might happen. Brian's hands shook. Mom, we can work something out. You don't want to run a business and keep this house. It is staying in the family, I said firmly. With me. But the mortgage payments, Chelsea began. Walker Construction's income will cover them easily, I said. Tom Bradley assures me the business is stable. I stood, smoothing my dress. Now, you mentioned moving out. I think that's still an excellent idea. Not for me, of course, I said calmly, but I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to start fresh. Brian stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Mom, you can't be serious. After everything Dad did for you, after everything our family means. Your father did do everything for me, I interrupted. He loved me enough to make sure I'd never be at anyone's mercy, not even my own son's. And now I understand how much I needed that protection. Chelsea, her face twisted with anger, was already at the door. This isn't over, Martha. We'll fight this. We'll contest everything. You're welcome to try, I said evenly. Everything your father did was legal and properly documented. Margaret Morrison has already given copies of every document to my attorney. Brian lingered at the door, his face conflicted. I don't understand, Mom. Why are you doing this to us? I'm not doing anything to you, I replied quietly. I'm refusing to let you do it to me. After they left, the house felt silent, but for the first time in decades that silence felt like peace. For the first time since I was a young woman, I was financially independent. No one could take anything from me now. Henry had given me more than security, he had given me freedom. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my new oceanfront cottage, watching the sun rise over the Pacific, golden light dancing across the water. The smaller cottage in Mendocino was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every detail reflected my taste, not compromises from 32 years of marriage. To my surprise, I discovered I had excellent taste when no one else was offering opinions. Walker Construction continued to thrive under Tom Bradley's management. Every Friday he called to update me and quarterly profits went directly into my account. I had kept my promise to run the business exactly as Henry structured it, and everyone seemed grateful for the stability. The cottage had been a surprise too. Margaret had discovered the deed while organizing assets. Henry had purchased it 3 years ago through the trust. Inside the folder was a note in his handwriting. For Martha's retirement, when she's ready for ocean air and no schedule but her own. Even after his death, Henry was still taking care of me. This morning was important. My attorney, James Patterson, no relation to Helen from the bank, arrived right on time. His calm, precise nature had been a comfort through all this. Good morning, Martha, he said, taking his usual seat by the window. I have the final settlement for you to review. I poured coffee from the French press, one of the small freedoms I now enjoyed. How did they take it? James's mouth twitched in amusement. About how you'd expect. Brian's lawyer argued family obligations should outweigh business contracts, but the law is clear. He handed me the papers. After 6 months of legal wrangling, Brian and Chelsea had signed a payment plan to repay the full debt, now just over $96,000 with interest. It would take them 8 years if they didn't miss payments. They asked for a forgiveness clause, James added, and Brian actually broke down, saying you were destroying your relationship with your only son over money. And what did you say? I asked. I reminded them I represent your financial interests, not your family ties. I may have mentioned that most mothers don't have to sue their children to collect debts. The settlement also included something that gave me quiet satisfaction. If Brian and Chelsea defaulted, the business could garnish Brian's wages and place liens on any property they bought. There's one more thing, James said, handing me an envelope addressed in Brian's handwriting. Inside was a short note. Mom, I know you probably won't forgive me for fighting you, but I finally understand what Dad was doing. Losing almost everything made me realize how much I took for granted. Chelsea and I are in marriage counseling and I'm working 2 jobs to keep up with the payments. I hope someday you'll talk to me again. I'm sorry. I folded the letter carefully. The apology was genuine but 6 months too late, and driven more by consequences than conscience. Any response you'd like me to send? James asked. No, I said firmly. If Brian wants to rebuild a relationship, he can do it the same way he'll pay off his debt. Gradually, consistently, over time. After James left, I took my coffee out to the deck and reread Brian's letter. The grief was still there, not just for Henry but for the son I thought I'd raised. Yet beneath the sadness was something stronger. Deep satisfaction that I had stood up for myself when it mattered. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The number looked unfamiliar, but I answered. Hello, Mrs. Walker. This is Linda Morrison, Margaret's daughter. I hope you don't mind me calling. My mom told me about what happened with your family. I'm starting a support group for women who've faced financial manipulation by family members. Would you be willing to share your experience? The request caught me off guard. I'm not sure what I'd say. You'd be surprised how many women need to hear it, Linda said gently. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' money, spouses who hide financial information. Your story could help others protect themselves. I looked out at the ocean watching a pelican dive. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow facing homelessness. Now I was free, living life on my own terms. When would you like me to speak? I asked. Really? You'll do it. I think I will, I said, smiling. Not about revenge or legal battles, but about the difference between being a loving family member and being a doormat. About knowing your rights. About the gift Henry gave me when he protected my future, even from our own son. We scheduled the talk for the following month. Hanging up, I realized helping other women felt like a purpose. A way to honor Henry's love and my own hard-won independence. That evening, as the sun set, I did something I'd begun doing every night since moving here. I sat on the deck with a glass of wine, watching the sunset, letting myself savor the simple truth that this view, this peace, this life was entirely mine. No one could take it, no one could vote me out of my own home, and no one could decide I was disposable. The only sounds were the ocean's steady rhythm and the distant cries of seabirds settling for the night. Tomorrow I'd tend to my garden, maybe drive into town for lunch at the little bistro where the owner always saved me the table by the window. Simple pleasures completely mine. Brian's debt would be paid eventually, whether he managed it responsibly or through wage garnishment. The legal settlement guaranteed that. But the real victory wasn't about money. It was the strength I'd found to demand the respect I deserved. And now, to you listening to my story, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever faced something like this? Tell me in the comments. And before you go, I've left 2 other stories on the final screen, favorites on the channel, and they just might surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until the end.